faces because of that, do you? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with the mobile web, and I'll just get right into who I am. I graduated with a degree in physics. I was originally computer science, and I got onto that track once the whole bubble burst back in 2000 or so. And I went into physics because I figured it's been around forever. It's not going to burst. But there are no jobs in physics unless you keep going on the academic track. So my brother, of JRuby fame, told me, why don't you take a look at Ruby on Rails? Because I know you've done some coding in the past. You like the web, and I think it's a pretty cool platform or framework. And so I took a look at it, and for the first time, I really got programming and actually making an application. I'd done static websites up to that point, and worked with FrontPage and Dreamweaver and all that, but never actually made an application. It was Rails that kind of solidified to me what you could do with a good framework and a really pleasant language, which I find Ruby to be. And I started my career as a web developer. And it's been going about 4 or 5 years now, and I've made countless websites for both my own personal projects and clients. And then I've also been a really big Apple fan. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the Rails community, at least I've noticed. Rails is a very opinionated framework, and Apple is a very opinionated company. They like to put in only the features that they really need and then polish them. And because I was an Apple fan, another thing my brother had pushed me into, I was waiting with bated breath, like a lot of people were, at the Apple phone, which turned out to be the iPhone. And to me, the most intriguing part of the iPhone was the browser. And I think that they got the most gasps and the biggest reaction when they showed what it could actually be like to browse the web on your phone and not use a WAP browser and all that. I've had smartphones for years, and I had many leading up to the iPhone announcement, but it was never a pleasant experience to browse the web, as a lot of you probably know. And then when you first saw them pinching and zooming and panning and using the web from a small device in a real useful way, it was a kind of a light bulb moment for me and a lot of developers, web developers specifically, because now we can reach this whole wide market. It was obvious that the iPhone was going to become a huge success, which it has. And it was a really good thing. They didn't launch with an app store. They didn't have an SDK for developing applications, and there really was no indication, as is the case with Apple, whether or not they were going to be doing that. So it looked like web was going to be a first-class citizen. Steve Jobs himself said that web applications should behave like native apps on the iPhone, and it seemed like that was the direction they were going to go in. So that's pretty cool. We can make websites, expect them to work in Safari, and we're really first-class citizens of this new platform. We don't have to learn a new language or SDK or process, and as I said before, the browser is just awesome. But then, a year later, they announced the beta for the App Store, and everything changed. Which, the App Store is a pretty big deal. I mean, even when you look at the icon, it looks kind of like it's zooming out to you, like from on high, the App Store has come to you. And Apple really pushed the App Store, and to this point, have kind of made that the first-class citizen of the iPhone. Suddenly, they're the most important thing. They released the SDK beta in 2008, and they get an annual revenue of about $2.4 billion from apps. And the question is, why did Apple have kind of or seemingly have an about face on really pushing forward web technology and the standards in web technologies, to pushing developers into the app and their SDK and that whole platform? Considering Apple's revenue is about $65 billion, and $2.4 billion is about 3% of that, it's not, I don't think, about the money, and it never really was. Apple, as you all know, is a hardware company. They do whatever they can to sell hardware, and software is not something they're interested in earning revenue from, unless it's their mobile me service, which I don't think they make much from. But yeah, they want to sell iPads and iPhones, and Macs, although to a lesser extent these days. So I think the big reason that they really liked the idea of an app store was because they're all about user experience. They want to control the solution from the beginning all the way to the end. They're very particular about how they want apps to look, how they want them to work, what kind of apps get on the App Store, as you all know. And I think because it's such a small slice of their pie, and because they still champion web standards, it's not so much that Apple's really declared war on the mobile web, or is ignoring the mobile web. There have been people who've gone as far as to say that on the next version of iOS, you're going to see Safari as an optional install, because apps have taken over everything. But I think it's more that Apple has started to finally see some competition in this space. They know that if they can get a lot of developers locked into their platform and a lot of people locked into their apps, choosing an iPad over a Zoom, for instance, is going to be an easier choice for customers as far as Apple's concerned, because they have this huge app library. Think if 90% of those apps have been developed using web technologies. You go out and buy a Zoom, and you can access 90% of those apps. They're all based on WebKit, the browsers. So I don't know if it's a conflict of interest, but this is the way it's gone, and now there's this huge fragmentation between the App Store and other app solutions for Android and Windows Mobile and the other phones. So, and they're getting worse with the apps too. This is me kind of blatantly boasting. John Gruber can eat his heart out. I said that I think that OS X is going to turn into iOS, and you're going to see an app store come in the full frontal view of the operating system, and the file system is going to kind of go away, and they're going to make things easier for the average consumer. You just go to an app store and you click and you buy it. And they're really, really moving in this direction, pushing forward with it. And then this happened. The iFart app came out, and everyone heard about this app making $10,000 a day for the developer, which is good money, and it's exciting, and it was a huge gold rush to the app platform. So a lot of people who normally wouldn't ever have considered learning a new language or getting into a new framework or SDK were suddenly starting to think, well, now I can charge for my apps. They can be as dumb as this app, and I can get rich, and I can do it now. And as you know, there's been a really big push for appifying everything these days. And there are a lot of good reasons to go native, and I feel I should touch on them. And there's obvious reasons. Native applications, they do run faster. They're compiled. They have more access to APIs that the browser doesn't. So they have more RAM, they have access to 3D capabilities and better GPU access. And because of this, you can be sloppier in your coding, and you'll be penalized for it less. Obviously, you can maximize your efficiency and make some really slick applications, but if you're sloppy when you're coding apps for mobile devices using web technologies, you run into limitations a lot faster, just because you don't have as much access to the hardware as native apps do. There's also a lot of consistency between apps. Apple has very strict human interface guidelines. They have an interface builder for a lot of developers out there who don't want to deal with the interface side of things. They don't want to be designers, developers. This makes the process a lot simpler because they can just make Apple-looking software using Apple tools and ship the product and work on the product they want to, which is just the actual functionality of it. The App Store is also safe. It's safe for consumers. It's safe for developers. You don't have to worry about your software getting pirated as much. As a consumer, you don't have to worry about your software offending you or giving you viruses. And the experience has been very nice for both developers and consumers in the App Store. And it's extremely convenient. They've had this whole Amazon one-click thing in the App Store for a long time, and people can impulsively buy applications and install them. And and this is a big reason why I think the gold rush became so big, was because everyone realized, well, people have these phones in their pockets, it's tied directly to a credit card. If they see my app and they like it, I get some instant revenue right there. And it's super easy to do. And they also have access to more APIs that the web browser doesn't. So the file system, push notifications, the camera, although we're getting more access to this stuff as we go along, but there's definite limitations here. And then just the actual fact that we can go back to charging for our software, which in the world of the web is kind of a radical shift, because everything has been free or freemium for a long time, and we've been coming up with a lot of creative ways to get revenue from our software. But selling a piece of software or access to a piece of software at a one-time price and getting money up front was kind of unheard of in the web world. And now we're going back to the standard desktop application model, and this was attractive to a lot of developers. But I think a big reason we like the App Store is because we like seeing our logo in the App Store. And there's a lot of people out there who push the app development process to its edge, and they really take advantage of these extra capabilities, but a good majority of the applications out there are just serving data, or just serving information. And they would work just as well as a web app, but there's something visceral, or there's something very pleasing about having a wrapper around your product and access through this App Store. It's almost like validation. And so you'll see a lot of stuff out there that really works just as well as a website, but is on the App Store and maybe doesn't belong there. And then there's things that I personally don't like about apps. For all the good that apps have, there are significant drawbacks, in my opinion. So I think that the biggest downside, at least for me as a developer, is the initial cost, both opportunity cost and just cost in time and money in developing a native application. And had Apple run away with the iPhone and mobile market, it wouldn't have been as big a deal, but now with this fragmentation, you're looking at spending upwards of $30,000 is the number that a lot of people kind of agree on for a world-class, high-quality iPhone app from start to launch. And then if you want to hit a broader market, you're going to have to look at the other platforms that are coming up, like Android, and you're probably going to spend the same amount of money because you're working with different tools and different languages. And then as a company, you're going to have to spend this money on developers or outsource it and do this multiple times to get your app on the store. So that's probably the biggest drawback I can think of at this point. And then that's only the half of it. If you spend 6 months or you spend $30,000 developing your application and it doesn't get approved by Apple, it can be a pain in the butt to get it approved. You have to go through a couple different iterations, and it may run up against something that Apple just won't bend on, and then it's a complete loss. So that's you're kind of gambling when you make an app these days because of this opaque approval process. And I'm not sure that we need an approval process, and I think it's kind of ruffled a lot of the feathers out there in the development community, because there's really no real solid way of telling whether or not you're going to run into complications. I think a big problem now that we've reached the billions or millions of apps that are out on the store right now, that's kind of cropped up, has been discovering applications. And there have been some attempts to solve this with actual iPhone applications and websites, but the discovery of the applications, I think, largely still happens either by the top 10 list on the different categories you see in the App Store, which, if you're on that top 10 list, you'll ask any developer who's been there, you rake in a ton of cash. But if you're not, you're kind of doomed to obscurity, and it's on you to spread the word of mouth, or do your own marketing on a website, and do the kind of grassroots stuff that most web developers do anyways when they're making web applications without an app store, to get your product promoted. So and the more and more this the apps start to roll into the store, the worse the problem gets. And if you're going to spend a lot of time making a website to promote your app, a lot of the times the functionality can be reproduced with web technologies. I wonder, why not just make the website you've made to promote it the app itself? Now you're not giving away 30% of your profits to Apple. You did all the work in getting that there in the first place, and the user can use it immediately. So another thing about apps, the egocentric and antisocial nature of them is, if we have an app for every website out there, if Engadget has their own app, Gizmodo, Chili's, we're downloading apps for every commercial entity out there, the browsing experience has been totally destroyed. You launch into the Wendy's app and you look at the nutritional information for their fries, and then you want to know about their comparison to McDonald's. Well, now you got to launch into the McDonald's app, and you're kind of jumping in and out of solutions. When before, when working with the web, it's always been a very seamless process to change your URL or to link from one site to another, and it's kind of this organic process of discovering information. Now it's becoming very fragmented and compartmentalized. The more and more companies start to come up with their own app, whether or not there really is a need for it. It puts it in perspective if you think about if we had a different desktop application for every single website that was out there. You have an Engadget website or a desktop application for their website and so on. It's not the way that the internet works, and it's very contrary to how we think about moving from information provider to information provider, which is really what most of the apps out there are. And then I mentioned that fragmentation is another really big problem, especially now that Android is becoming popular and even more popular in terms of user adoption than Apple is. And then, of course, the big deal inked between Nokia and Microsoft, Nokia being the biggest handheld provider in the world. Now you're having some significant fragmentation in the marketplace, and you're talking about 3 or 4 times your development cost just to get into the app stores of all these different solutions. And then, of course, as I've mentioned a little bit, Apple has very strict terms about how you build their software, or software for their app store, what you build. So it's all it's censored. It has to be approved by their approval process, and then they also decide how much of this money you get to keep. They have the 30-70 split, which they've now extended to subscription services, which is another, at least in terms of the developer community, is another big misstep, according to a lot of people, because if you're talking about a service like Evernote, who's charging a certain amount for their service, Apple's demanding that they charge the same amount on the App Store, but they're taking their 30%. And if you're running thin margins, that 30% may put you over the edge, and you can't raise the price on the App Store to compensate for it. And this is causing a lot of people to think twice about whether or not they want to go native with their subscription-based revenue models and applications. So this is what I want my iPhone to look like. And these days, and it really, if you were to rank my applications by the amount that I use them, Safari would be #1 on the list by a wide margin. I don't even like to make phone calls. I don't know how many people here are using their phone less and less as a phone. This was mentioned in the talk during lunch. But these days, I want to be able to send email to you, text message. All of these things can be facilitated on the web. Heck, even phone calls through Skype and other providers could be done using web technologies, provided the right API existed. So I think that if we look at a web-centric view of the iPhone, there's not a whole lot. If this was what the phone looked like, in fact, if you just hit the power button and Safari popped up, I think we could have a pretty compelling solution that was based entirely on web technologies. And you can look at what Palm and now HP has kind of done with WebOS. They've really gone all in on this new web technology-centric operating system, and I think Android And Google is really moving in that direction too, saying that this is the grand unifier. And so this shows you the fragmentation right now. Android is really catching up with Apple. This is the Q4 sales. And of course, Symbian is going to look more and more like Windows Mobile, depending on how that goes. It could go up or down. But the point being, we're looking at 3 different WebKit solutions, or 4 different WebKit solutions in one Windows Mobile. So WebKit is really the thing that's tying everything together for these. There's slight differences in the way that they're implementing them and what APIs they have available, but by and large, you're going to get relatively the same experience from device to device because of that. And Android, this is just a graph I pulled from a news article in the last week, and there's been a lot of news revolving around JavaScript performance and browser performance in general on these devices, and Android has been doing really well with their performance. And Apple actually is really pushing hard on their performance too, and they've upgraded their JavaScript engine, and it looks like these problems that we've had with web apps not performing as well is going to become less and less of a problem as the mobile browser becomes more capable. And so I'm a big fan of the web. Anyone can get on there. It's a very low barrier to entry. You can mash things up and tie APIs together, and there's no one way to do things. There's no one place to go to get the web. It's kind of the wild west of development, which is really intriguing to me. And more people, and not just people, but devices in general, devices to keep track of how well you sleep or how many steps you take in a day, are being connected to the internet. So that's the most intriguing part of it. And if we focus on the web as a development solution, it's all a very natural fit. There's no SDKs that we need to use or developer agreements to develop for the web. If you want to develop for the web, you pick a process, you pick a language, and you go for it. You don't have to worry about your stuff getting approved. And there's frankly no one right way to make money. And there's a wide variety of different models out there that you can use. So it's really open. There are problems with the web too. It being unregulated can be a problem, as we all know. There's a lot of information on the web, and it's, I think, a good thing and a bad thing in that, as a developer, if you're thinking about the barrier of entry being so low to web development, you're really a very small fish in a very big ocean. And I think the first thing, especially early on in the App Store, that intrigued people was that now I can reach an audience better, I have less competition, there's a bigger barrier to entry for people learning the development kit. And so that can be a problem with web as well. And then there's performance limitations. We're never going to be as fast as native applications. And the web, frankly, wasn't really intended to be a very rich experience when it was first invented. And then, of course, there's the problem of persistent connections. If the web goes away, and that's how we're serving our data and our interface to the user, then we have a real problem. Although these days, I would say it's probably harder to not be on the internet than it is to be on the internet. So, can the web compare to native? And that's my answer. I think it can, and I put my asterisk up there just in case I'm wrong later on, because I may be, and then I can go back to this and say, well, this is what I actually meant. Can anybody tell me what this is? Very good. It is the first web page ever, and that's the next box that was serving it. And if you read that, it says the World Wide Web is a way of linking documents and giving universal access to large universal documents. This was its intention. And it works very well for that, as we all know. This was not the intention of the web. Have you tried the Mobile Me service based on Structure? extremely rich user interface and amazing interaction. It almost feels exactly like iPhoto or like Mail or like the calendar app. When you think about what it started out as, just a way to push bits back and forth so scientists could share data sets, and you think about what it's become, this argument that the mobile web will never be as capable or will never perform as well as native, has always struck me as kind of odd, because the one reason why we've pushed the web, and we've pushed it to the point where it really, no one ever could have predicted it would have gone, is because everything is connected. And it's this wide user base and this wide open kind of openness of the internet that has intrigued people so much to come out with these hacky or tacked on or very strange techniques to get every last ounce of power out of web browsers and web applications. And today, more than ever, you see some very extremely intriguing frameworks coming out and some amazing user interfaces. And this, of course, is a desktop app, but we'll get into some web apps that have just as intriguing interfaces. So we're finally getting some pretty interesting APIs on the new mobile Safari. We finally have WebSockets. We have better SVG support. We have the orientation API, so you can have apps that you twist your phone around and it'll move a ball or whatever. So eventually, I think we're going to see access to the camera and other APIs, and Google's actually going to move forward on that front faster than Apple is, but it's clear that they're still pushing the browser side of this. And this was the JavaScript in 2.34, I think, or 4.3, I think, for iOS that's going to be coming out that significantly improves performance for mobile Safari. And there was a little hubbub about that because when you tack a mobile website onto the home page to make it act like a real application, it doesn't get access to this new JavaScript engine, which again raised questions about whether Apple's really serious about supporting the mobile web and new web technologies. But Gruber was quick to point out, John Gruber, for those who don't read, Daring Fireball was quick to point out that it was more of a security measure and that Apple is still very serious about supporting mobile standards. So I think the future does look bright in terms of what we're going to be able to work with. But what approach do you take? And there's a couple different ways to do it these days, and you've probably heard of some of these, but I'll go through the ones I find the most intriguing and some of the ones that I've worked with myself. There's traditional, hybrid, and compiled. The compiled solutions, their goal is really to allow you to write in a language that that you are more familiar with, like JavaScript, or in the case of Row Mobile, it's Ruby. Corona lets you script in Lua, which is a popular scripting language for gaming development, but very Ruby-like. And then have it compile down to actual Objective-C code that runs natively on these on the iPhone. And then they also promise cross-platform support, so you can do all this and then launch on a wider variety of devices. So in the case of Titanium, they'll give you Android and iPhone support and get most of the APIs covered. These are good solutions, but you're going to be limited. You're kind of stuck in between two worlds. You're not going full native. You're not developing with Apple's SDK. So as soon as you start to move outside of the way that AppCelerator does things, or the way that Corona does things, you're going to run into headaches and figure, well, I might as well just learn the native side of it. I've played around with Corona a little myself. You can create really compelling, not 3D, but 2D physics-based games, and you do it really quickly. I suggest you check it out. But the problem is that once you start to really push the technology and come up with your own customizations, you run into limitations pretty quickly. And I would say that if you're going to go this direction, There are other solutions, which would be the lightweight, which you can actually just apply your web development experience and get pretty close to the same experience. JQuery and jQuery are both built upon the concept where you're progressively enhancing regular HTML with JavaScript and making an iPhone-like interface, kind of getting it for free. And then on devices that don't support those transitions or touch, it'll still render properly. It won't work the same way, it won't look as pretty, but at least you're hitting a wider user base in that case. Sencha Touch is another solution. So you can see that they're really trying to mimic the way that most iPhone apps look, where they're built with the SDK, the native apps. They have the list views. When you transition, the pages swipe to the left. They're following the same basic human interface guidelines that Apple has been pushing for its own native applications. JQuery is the one that I have the most experience with. This is a pretty mature platform, and it has nice callbacks, and you can develop an entire application and back it with whatever web framework you want. But the developer that has moved on to Sencha Touch, which he's claiming is a more professional approach to building these native web applications, but it's definitely more of a framework. And if you start to move out of the way that Sencha Touch does things, then you'll run into more problems. So you really subscribe to the way that they organize things, an MVC architecture, and you'll get really good results. They have a solitaire application that I would say rivals most of the native solitaire applications that you see on the App Store. It's really impressive, and it was built with Sencha, which has also an iPad-focused framework, which jQuery Mobile does not. jQuery Mobile is really trying to hit as many devices as they can. Their theory is, if we can get your website in a really easy way, deployed to as many different browsers as we can, we'll provide you the best benefit. It's still an alpha right now, but it's becoming more mature. And it's from the same guys who did the jQuery UI. And I think that this is a solution that if I were to do it again, I'd probably look into, especially once they hit beta, because I'm a big fan of jQuery in general. And so they're trying to hit all the devices that have browser scores of A for their native browsers. But another option, which is an intriguing option, is just to roll your own framework and just work with the tools that you're given and the APIs that you have access to, and optimize it just like you would any other application. And the best example of this is the Everytime Zone made by the /7 co-founders, Amy Hoy and Thomas Fuchs. Thomas Fuchs is of Scriptaculous fame. They wanted to make a time zone application that was very visually pleasing, didn't have a lot of checkboxes and all that, and they wanted to use web technology so that it would work on all devices that could access it. And they used Canvas for this in HTML5. Totally custom interface. And they have a really intriguing blog post about how they kind of went point by point, figuring out all the slow, inconsistent problems that they had and ran into, like, for instance, adding drop shadows would slow things down, and so they advise against that, at least in the interim. Using Translate 3D instead of Translate, and keeping the animations that you use with WebKit Transform to a minimum. And they're working within the confines and the abilities of their software. And they got a really nice experience out of it, which is, I would say, was one of the high watermarks of what you can do with an HTML5 application. Basecamp is another mobile solution that is intriguing because they originally decided to have an iPhone developer. They brought someone in-house, but then they realized, well, we're really good at making web applications, and if we want to support this thing long-term and update it, we might as well use web technologies, hit more devices in the process, and then we don't have to keep someone on staff to keep updating the software. They ended up rolling their own as well because they like the interfaces that you get and the frameworks that you can use, like jQuery Touch and JQ Touch, but they wanted to do something more customized. And I wouldn't be surprised if they came up with an open source version of their solution in the future here. But they wanted something that felt a lot like Basecamp, so they ended up doing their own thing. And it works very well, and it's very reminiscent. You have the tabs and everything of Basecamp. And they figure we'll add more functionality over time, and we're working in a language and a framework that we understand and are comfortable with. And another really good example of using HTML5 to good effect is Netflix. As many of you probably know or use, Netflix has applications for the iPhone, the iPad. They have Xbox 360, PS3. They're trying to get on as many devices as possible. And they actually use HTML5 to develop all their applications on all these different platforms. The most recent being PlayStation 3, totally HTML5. What this allows them to do is push out updates immediately and get feedback on them, or do user tests and get feedback on those user tests right away. They actually peg that as the most important aspect of developing with HTML5 and JavaScript, because being able to iterate quickly and not have to go through a process of updating is a better way for them to build user experiences. And I actually have to admit, the iPhone and iPad apps, Netflix apps, they don't feel exactly native, and they're wrapped in an actual native application using PhoneGet, which lets you get these web JavaScript HTML applications on the devices. But let's be honest, it's just trying to serve video, and that's all I care about. If I can get to my movie and watch it and search for the ones that I want to watch after that, I'm pretty happy. So I would say that they're a pretty good example. The best example is the way that Google is approaching mobile development and embracing the HTML5 movement. Their mail application rivals what Apple does with its native mail application. I think this is true in the desktop case too. Their map application feels almost exactly like the map application you find on the iPad or the iPhone. And it has access to the same APIs too. It'll find where you are and give you directions where you need to go. But their experiences are so phenomenal, in my opinion, that really, when it comes to developing these things, if we can get to the point where we feel our applications feel like a Gmail or a YouTube or Google Maps, we're probably hitting most of the bases that we need to. Eric Schmidt, the Google CEO, is really going along on HTML5, and I think given the amount of apps and the amount of revenue that the Android App Store is producing, which is dwarfed by the iPhone App Store, I think that what Apple's going to do is they're going to say, well, HTML5, if we can make this an important technology, then this is going to be the biggest assault we can make against the App Store and iPhone dominance in the marketplace. Because as a developer, would you rather develop something that's going to get distributed across a wide array of mobile devices using WebKit, or just one store and then eventually another store? So when you're rolling your own, there's a couple tools you can use out there. iScroll is it's kind of a tool set which has been in very active and heavy development. The guy who does it is awesome. Basically, when you develop on an iPhone, keeping things static, like fixed in place, isn't really an option. So the traditional CSS methods of putting a toolbar at the top of your screen and allowing them to scroll another portion wasn't really straightforward, and it wasn't supported by mobile Safari. What iScroll does is it allows you to have scrollable areas on an iPad or an iPhone web application, and it works with Android and all the other WebKit mobile devices as well. And he's following the same design patterns he's seeing with Twitter, where you can pull down to refresh, or pan through a list of items and have it lock in place based on a grid. So combining just your own JavaScript expertise with some of the littler tool sets that are out there, like iScroll, I think you can get a lot of mileage out of it and make compelling, different user experiences that you would normally only see in a native environment. And then the hybrid approach would be basically taking JQuery, jQuery Mobile, or any of these fully HTML5 JavaScript solutions and packaging it in PhoneGap, which is a company that lets you put your app that's been developed with web technologies in the App Store, and then gives you access to the APIs that you normally wouldn't have had access to, like the camera and the push notifications. And then another really intriguing option is these very, very robust JavaScript front-end solutions, like Cappuccino and SproutCore. SproutCore came out of Apple, which is now open source, but that was the framework used to build their mobile me applications. So their mobile mail, the iPhoto sharing application. It makes for a very fluid and performant user experience because it's running all this Java in the front end. And the best example of the performance that you can get out of this would be the NPR clone app. So if you have an iPad and you've seen this NPR app, it essentially works where you can swipe left and right on these different tiles and you'll see the different news stories, and you can hit play and it'll play the news story. What SproutCore did as an example of what you can do with the web technology today is they cloned this application, made it run in the browser, and independent tests showed that it actually, in some cases, ran better than the native version of this NPR app, which is a really intriguing thing, because the browsers are going to get faster and faster, which we're seeing they are. If we can build stuff that's just as native, or native feeling, and just as fast, then we don't have to go through these channels and learn frameworks and languages that we might not have otherwise. So there's a lot of things to consider about whether or not you should use web technologies to build. Are you just serving content, or are you building a 3D game or something that requires more horsepower? What exactly is it that you're planning on giving to the consumer? And that right there usually answers your question about whether or not you could just do this as a mobile application. And if you already have a web service in place, in the case of 37 Signals, they already had Basecamp. Most of their users are using the web interface, so there was really no reason for them to create a completely different solution in a different language, in an uncomfortable environment, just to provide the same experience when they can just throw a layer on top of their web service as it is now and get the same effect. And are you using the web to market your application already? If so, then maybe that's the way you want to go with your mobile device. And are you going to be selling subscriptions? As I mentioned, this has become kind of a controversial issue with Apple in the App Store. And do you need access to 3D gaming? And that kind of stuff isn't there yet. I mean, there are obviously very compelling reasons to use native technologies, but I think the vast majority of solutions out there are really just serving basic data. So yeah, these are a few of the questions that I ask when people are considering going native with their stuff. And you hear a lot of people say, well, you can't get the same experience on a native app that you could on a web app. And I think if you check out some of those demos, like the NPR clone, 37 Signals mobile solution, you'll see that you can get pretty darn close. And when it comes to it, pretty darn close for 80% more users is a pretty good compromise to make. Making more money, I think, is a big myth. It was recently calculated that you get about $8,000 on average from an application, and this is including all the long tail success you see from apps like Angry Birds. So it's a very conservative estimate at best. And really, it turns out that after your first customer, most people don't return. So we're going to be returning to subscription models in the app world anyways, which I think that's why Apple's moving quickly to come up with a solution for that. So I think making money hasn't been solved by the App Store. And then the fact that there is no App Store is starting to become less true, because Google's coming out with their mobile and desktop, or sorry, regular web App Store. Mozilla's coming out with an App Store that'll be mobile-centric. And then there are other App Stores out there that help you discover HTML5-based apps and not native apps. And I'll briefly, I guess we have like a couple of minutes now left, I'll talk a little bit about what I've done with JQ Touch. So I've been working with a teacher who came up with a system for grading students based on their effort. So you get your normal grade, and then he'll give them an extra little grade if they're paying attention or if they've answered questions. And he originally had wanted to do this, or thought about doing it as a native application, which, as I mentioned, would probably have run anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 if you want to have a really good experience. You'll launch first on the iPhone, and then if you want to move to other devices, you're looking at about the same development cost. And given the fragmentation, it quickly becomes intractable. So we thought, well, why not make a mobile version of it? We can do it a lot quicker. We can back it with a web service that at the same time we're making the mobile side of it, we're getting for free the web side of it. And you can launch on, Android, WebOS, iPhone, as many devices as you want, right out of the gate. And then you set your terms as far as your subscriptions. And you're not having to deal with Apple or give them a cut, and hoping that people see your app in the App Store. You're marketing from the beginning, you're taking it upon yourself to do that, and then you're reaping all the benefits from it. So we looked at using JQ Touch, which is it kind of wraps on top of a Rails application. So this is an example of the HTML markup with Rails Inline. This is what one of those pages would look like. And what JQ Touch is going through and doing is saying, okay, we have a list here. Let's display this as a nice iPhone list. And when I click a button here, I'm going to trigger an AJAX call and bring in a new page from the Rails application. To the user, when they're using the iPhone, it's very seamless. It feels like a native iPhone application. It's not quite as smooth as a native application, I'll admit, but I think to the average user, it's probably a wash. And when you load this up on the regular web browser, you have a different style sheet in place. You style this how you want for the web, and you're dealing with the exact same data here. So you've basically gotten every major web browser on the desktop covered, and the majority of the mobile web browsers covered, and you've only done the work once. So that's one of the more intriguing aspects of using JQ Touch or jQuery Mobile or any of these other solutions, is that I'm very comfortable working with web. I'm very comfortable working with Rails. A lot of the times you have to build some, if it's a connected service, you have to build some web framework or API to communicate with your iPhone application or your Android application anyways. So you might as well just take full advantage of the web technologies if you can make the interface nearly as compelling as a native application. So in my, for those of you familiar with Rails, in my controller, I can tell it to push out to iPhone. I can use a different template if I want to. It's all the same logic. I'm just distinguishing when the user first visits the site, what kind of device am I pushing out to? And how am I going to render this to them? It's all the same data. It's the same basic user experience, but it's two different ways of getting there. And the JavaScript is just JavaScript. I call my iScroll function, which allows me to create my scrollable area. And I just write jQuery like I'm used to doing. And I get the same functionality that I would out of the mobile side as I would the desktop side. And when we launch across the whole spectrum. And so far it's worked out really well. He's been testing it in the classroom, and to him, the user experience is more about getting the data in there, having it work, and having it be consistent across both the web and mobile. So far it's been a really good success. And I would definitely recommend going this route in the future. And with these frameworks, I think it's possible.